So the 2023-2024 Global Human Development Report by UNDP called Breaking the Gridlock, Reimagining Cooperation in a Polarized World really addresses almost all of these together. 2021-2022, another alarming title, Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives. The spirit of maladaptation, unease is all around us for sure. So if you're actually looking at the fundamentals of human security, many of these are actually the same basics that we know about. Human security and peace, generally speaking, are undermined now by multilateral failure and global cooperation. Human development is dipping. This is what we see in human security reports. And then these external shocks effectively that are coming, like to Pakistan, from climate and environment as well. There's one curious thing, that this is the Institute for Regional Studies. The ambassador mentioned this as well. There's one really curious thing. A lot of the names associated with the human development concept actually come from this subregion. So whether we're talking about Amartya Sen, it's next door, whether we're talking about Salim Jahan, who was the head of our human development report, comes from next door in Bangladesh, or whether we're talking about Mahbub al-Haq, for example, comes from here. I don't know why this is, but the gurus of human development appear to be coming from this part of the world. It's really kind of curious. It could be that 1/4 of the world's population is here. Many of the problems are here, but presumably many of the solutions are also here. Or this general sense of realization that this link between education, health, and income can actually be conceived as both problematic and both a solution that comes from here. And if done correctly here, then maybe this is a trend for the future as well. So I started with where we are globally speaking, why insecurity is the way it is. And I think as aptly defined, freedom from want, freedom from fear, and freedom to live in dignity is the simplest form of understanding human security, and therefore undermining these three are the basis of insecurity. Maybe one more point about the global state of human development and human security, and then I'll come to Pakistan-specific issues. So 2 years in a row, human development dips. Last year, there was actually a positive uptick, but we're still lower in global human development than we used to be. Now, here's the curious thing. The countries that actually went back to previous human development levels and actually rose are wealthy countries, curiously enough. The North and the West OECD countries, broadly speaking, everybody else didn't, generally speaking. So this is, I think, what's important about also what was mentioned earlier. What does resilience in the face of multidimensional crises actually look like, and who is able to withstand it? If you believe that resilience in its most basic definition is the ability to flex but not break. We know now that for human development, if you have money, if you have functioning institutions, if you have an available stock to be able to go back to, like some of these OECD countries, you will be able to flex but not break in the face of global crises, climate change, COVID, trade problems, global interstate conflict, etc. But if you are a country that is not high on the Human Development Index, then you do have a challenge for sure. That is what's happening now. The recovery takes much, much longer and is uneven, unbalanced, unequal, and there is an issue. I've served before in Syria, previously in Yemen, in Sudan, and I know the Arab States region quite well. And for quite a long time, we've been concerned about how these conflicts that actually take place impact human development in these countries. Over 10 years worth of war in Syria now, have taken the country back about 4 decades of human development. And if the war stops now, the recovery will be long. Yemen, same thing. Sudan, the same thing. Gaza, I imagine the same thing. Even some parts of Ukraine, minus obviously the international support for Ukraine, that will also recover. We're only talking about brick and mortar, right? We're not talking about people's lives lost. We're not talking about potential future generations and their input. We're not talking about psychological trauma yet. We're only talking about brick and mortar buildings, etc. It'll take decades to actually get that back. Now to actually come back to Pakistan on human development and I think human security as well. So if you like comparators, I think the ambassador mentioned some. So in the Global Human Development Report, Breaking the Gridlock, Pakistan in the previous one, 2021, 2022, ranked 161, 2023, 2024 Human Development Index for Pakistan, 164. So Pakistan is going in the other direction, is dipping. For comparison purposes, not for neighborly envy or anything, but this is public knowledge. If you're curious about Afghanistan, 182, very, very low. Bangladesh, 129, India, 134, Iran, 78. And I generally like to compare Egypt and Pakistan. I feel they're kind of sort of have similarities, political, economic, even the Indus and the Nile kind of look the same with the Delta and all of that. Egypt is at 105. Pakistan is at 164. A bit of a surprise for me when I actually looked at these numbers. Haiti this year is 158 or 159. I don't know if we're recording this or not, but Haiti is run by gangs, right? So if you are concerned about human development, you are rightfully concerned. We did our National Human Development Report this year, aware of what the regional says and what the global says, and we focused on what we thought would actually be something of a bright point, which I will come to, which is digital transformation and where that fits in all of it. But the other numbers for Pakistan, I think, are also quite alarming as well. The richest 20% of Pakistanis have almost 5 times the income of the poorest 20%. That shouldn't be surprising to anyone. World Bank a couple of months ago, when they were launching their future prospect, basically says 40% of Pakistanis live in poverty. Growth this year will not be above 2%. Inflation is higher. That's not a great thing as well. The gender gap is quite startling. So gender gap index of 2024, Pakistan ranks 145 out of 146 countries. Not great. 22 million children out of school. You hear that often. Education and stunting are often going together. Yet Pakistan has 30% of its population under 30. And while some people see this as a problem, it could actually be the solution as well, where the youth bulge is a problem. A well-capacitated, skilled youth for the future, I think, is really quite critical. The positive news is that last year and this year, there are some positive indicators for macroeconomic conditions enough that the IMF has been discussing a new program of loans, quote unquote, for the future as well. It's actually a bigger program. So there are positive indicators for economic reforms that they, I think, see in the future too. Now, I actually took a look at the first IMF loan program in 1958. So we are now about to start the 24th program, whether it's the extended facility or the standby agreement. Now, here's a small quiz. 1958, first IMF standby agreement. What is the amount of that particular loan? I'll take a couple of guesses and then I'll tell you. Just throw a number out. Yes, it is $25,000. It's amazing, right? And curiously enough, most of the loans, apart from the last few years, are actually not that big. They're mostly 500,000, 700,000, etc. But you can see how much of a difference we are in now as well. Now, Pakistan, I think, if you look at just the last couple of years, there are a few things that are important also from a multidimensional perspective that cause concern. Certainly the macroeconomic financial situation. There is what people have termed for quite a long time political instability. We just call it some kind of political transition or other. I have been here for 1 year. I've already seen 3 governments. I arrived last August. There's a caretaker government, and now there's a new government. None of this is surprising. This is part of what happens. So for folks in the development sector or the political sector, political transition, democratic transition is actually expected. Even the fact that some elections actually have grievances before, during, and after is also unexpected. UNDP generally works in, yes, sustainable development, income, livelihoods, etc. Also gender, also climate change, but also governance. And curiously enough, this country office has one of the biggest governance programs in the region and probably globally. Elections, support to ECP, Elections Commission, but also rule of law, also human rights, also reform, and a whole host of other things that we think are really quite important as well. So just the last year in Pakistan, macroeconomic challenge, political transition, leftover impacts from the flood, obviously, in 2022, which caused quite a lot of damage as well. And then obviously the neighborhood, the challenges of the neighborhood that comes with the territory, what's been happening with Afghanistan, these skirmishes with Iran, the continued diplomatic standoff, obviously with India, and all of these impacts as well. So I think if you are concerned about Pakistan's future development in relation to human security, I think these are the kinds of things that are important to look at. We had a quick chat with the ambassador before we came in. Indeed, there is no peace without sustainable development. There's no sustainable development without peace. This goes without saying. And I think this is really quite important. But if everything becomes a chicken and the egg, do we start with this and get to that? Do we start with this and get to that? Then I think there is this sense of paralysis that we can get to. The development folks are waiting for peace to come, and then we can work. The peace folks are saying the fundamental structural challenges are the ones that are undermining peace. So please fix poverty, fix climate, fix all of these things, and then peace will miraculously happen. Trickle up or trickle down is not the kind of approach that we have now. And that's why almost everything that we do now here, and I think this probably is a reasonable approach to the things, whether it's on human security or whether it's on human development, we always say that almost everything that we do is people-centered and institutions-based. So it's great that you can support a lot of people, but where are the institutions that are accountable for the work in the future? Where are the institutions that offer predictability of services, whether you're talking about a social service, whether you're talking about access to social protection, or security, rule of law, police, etc. All of these things. There's one thing that I want to come back to, but I'd love to hear from you as well, which is part of the people-centered approach, which I think is critical for Pakistan, is the human capital part. So maybe I try to close with a couple of important areas that I think maybe will raise some questions, which I'd also love to hear from you. So if we are to think, for instance, in UNDP, working alongside all of our national partners, whether they're in government or civil society or the private sector, what are the three things that we actually want to invest in to support human development, which then leads to human security in the country? One is a clear investment in human capital. Almost everyone that we see here, whether we engage federally or provincially or even at district level, we see a lot of very well-capacitated individuals in the civil service or in civil society. We see a lot of educational institutions that are actually producing, in many cases, the right kind of skills for the future, but need to be directed to what the future looks like. If the future looks like digital data evidence-based, then maybe that's an area that requires some support. So an investment in human capital, I think, is quite critical. This is probably one of few lectures that I've been to where I think the majority of people here are younger than I generally am. So I think it's wonderful that also IRS is able to attract students, young professionals who are looking towards a future. So investing in human capital, I think, is really quite critical, whether we're talking about soft or hard skills, whether we're talking about those that want to be skilled in particular areas like vocational training, or those that want to be skilled in the public sector, et cetera. I think that's quite critical. Second, economic stability and predictability. And I'm not talking about macroeconomic stability. This is the kind of thing that perhaps, folks in finance and planning and economic affairs division and the SIFC, et cetera, are having these mega discussions with the politicians around the budget, around the IMF, around the next set of loans. But think, for example, about macroeconomic stability, individual to individual, small and micro enterprise, which there's a lot here, female-led businesses, which there are a lot here as well, where people that we support and that you support are trying not only to get by, but to get ahead. That, I think, is the critical thing. And then the predictability of that, the predictability of the institution, where you think that the service that you're getting today, you will actually get tomorrow, because this institution will be there, because the rules are clear, and because whatever reform discussions are actually going in the right future. And then maybe the third thing is the trust factor. And I think this has a horizontal level and it has a vertical level as well. Horizontally, this idea of trust from neighbor to neighbor, from community to community is really quite important. This is what we generally call social capital or social cohesion. And then I think there's the vertical trust, the relationship between the individual and the authority or the government. Both of those generally come together, and for quite a long time, I've been keen on trying to figure out the relationship between these three other letters as well that all look the same, SC. Social contracts, social capital, and social cohesion. Presumably, you could say that social contracts is the vertical axis, the relationship between people and the individual. Social capital is the relationship between people and people. And if this goes up and this goes up, then social cohesion probably also goes up as well. In another discussion, we can talk about that too. So I would generally say that if you are concerned about human security and the fundamentals here in Pakistan, and how human development becomes a base for promoting human security, then I think these are the three things that I would consider: investing in human capital, where are we with the economics, and then trust and trustworthiness, etc. The one interesting area that I close with for the future is where are some starting points? So a country as big as Pakistan, you can say that we need everything at the same time at mega scale. Or for us, we've been trying to figure out entry points. One of these entry points is what we actually worked on for the Human Development Report, which is digital transformation, digital space. And this is a curious link to global discussions on human security. There's a task force, a UN task force over the last couple of years to actually look at what all of the UN agencies can do together to promote human security. And they effectively came up with five Ds. Delivering on development promises, data, dignity, dialogue for peace, and digital transformation. And here we are 2 years later with a National Human Development Report for Pakistan that focuses on digital transformation. And if you think that the digital space is not only a space where you can see hate speech, incitement, violence, digital insecurity, but is also a space for equalizing, for inclusion, for economizing, then I think that's where the hope is. In fact, our digital transformation human development report, apart from a lot of challenging data, came up with a few positive areas that Pakistan is already leading in. The use of digital wallets is very, very popular among women in Pakistan. The prevalence of smartphones, not bad, but could be better. And that I think is really quite important. So just to close, there are a few areas that I think are important to focus on for development here in Pakistan. And if we were to pick one and maybe talk a little bit more about that I think promotes predictability, human security, as well as equality and equity, perhaps digital space is one area. There's quite a lot more to say, but I think maybe I've said enough for now. Happy to take a couple of questions, but in addition to that, I'd love to hear your perspective on anything and everything that was mentioned and anything beyond that. So Ambassador Salim and the IRS family, thank you so much again for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here with you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, sir, for sharing your valuable insights. You very rightly highlighted the relationship between peace and sustainable development as the crux of your talk, because one cannot exist without the other. I now request Mr. Arish Khan, the head of Afghanistan program and editor of publication at Institute of Region Studies, to moderate the question answer session.
Thank you, Alina. We've had some sobering reflections on the state of affairs in Pakistan, but also Dr. Rizk ended it on a positive note, on a hopeful note. So let's hear the questions or any comments that anyone might have. Please be brief in your comments or questions, introduce yourselves, and feel free to ask anything.
Assalamualaikum, sir. My name is Talha and I'm leading the climate change program in IRS. I have two questions for you. According to EMDAD report back in 2023, we have 399 disasters around the world, which actually come from the top G20 economies around the world. And in the last year, recently Guardian reported that 2023, 5 biggest economies around the world, which includes US, UK, Norway, Canada, and Australia, issued the highest number of oil and gas licenses around the world. So no matter what we do in Pakistan or regionally, we cannot sustain the human development side because of the maladaptation, as you have mentioned. So in your regard, what is the way forward for Pakistan for securing the human development? The second thing is, sir, I want your comment on the issue of misinformation, because if you note that 22 July of 2024 was the hottest day ever recorded in the history of Earth. So when we hit the floods back in 2022, with which is the highest collateral damage for Pakistan, our counterparts issues that mentioned that we have corruption and bad governance in Pakistan. So how we can trust this multilateralism that even cannot answer the call for securing the release of the funds and for the pledges they made in the Geneva. Thank you.
Over to you. Who we take? Okay.
Assalamu sir. Good day to you, sir. My name is Moaz Manzoor. I'm from China program. Sir, basically, I have two questions. So the first question is that, as you have rightly mentioned, that Pakistan suffered in 2022 recent devastated floods in which $30 billion loss to the economy was made to Pakistan. Sir, I wanted to ask you one thing, that the loss and damage that we are not seeing very much significant in the funding mention of the loss and damage fund. I believe the latest number which I've read was, I believe $900 million were being mentioned, like these number will be given. I think these numbers are very meager and these are insignificant number for the development of Pakistan, as you have mentioned, that development takes around 30 years, 10 years, and these are the numbers. So what UNDP is playing role in this? And my second question, sir, to you is that we are seeing that in the United Nations, there are P5 members or P5 in the Security Councils, which have the power of the veto. So why not expand it? Like, why not give the General Assembly much more power? And I believe that this is the inherent contradiction or inherent problem in the UN because these 5 nations have the power to veto, and this led to non-consensus based. So I believe that I will be very much interested in your remarks in that. Thank you, sir.
Any other question? No, sir.
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I'm Anahil Shahid from Quaid-e-Azam University, and I'm currently an intern with the President panel. I want to question कि आपने जो है एक बोला था कि 3 pages आपने way forward present किया है. I want to ask you कि कोई ऐसी specific strategy जो कि अभी human index को जो HDI human development.
I can translate for you, but if you want to.
You mentioned about a 3 pages strategy you proposed. Would you mind sharing any one or 2 of them that can improve our HDI human index for Pakistan? Obviously, I'm just asking like something that you have means for and resources for that can be implemented immediately.
I think so. These are enough for this round. I would now ask you to.
Thank you very much. No, these are plenty for this round. So okay, so the five top oil and gas producing countries are some of the 5 biggest economies. Let me tell you another 5, and I think this relates to the second question. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council are the 5 largest producers of arm and military. So it's kind of curious, I think, that that we have come to this point where, and again, I mentioned this. One, there's the zero-sum part of it, which is my gain is your loss, your gain is my loss. And I'm afraid that the spirit of polarization that has now appeared in writing in Global Human Development Report undermines almost everything, whether it's agreements on climate change, or whether it's agreements on reform of the Security Council and the UN system to actually meet current demands. So I think that's a real challenge. I didn't speak so much about the Summit of the Future that's actually coming up this year as well in September, an initiative of the Secretary General. So there are 3 big parts of this summit. There's the Pact for the Future, there's the Global Digital Compact, and then there's the Pact for Future Generations as well. But the main document actually talks, and I think this relates more to the second question, the main document actually talks about Security Council reform. It is not possible moving ahead in the future for a system to manage and mitigate global conflict and promote peace that was built for 1944, 1945, to actually be suitable to the kinds of problems that we have now. And that, I think, is going to be the biggest challenge. If you're in a P5 position, you really don't want to give that up. And the General Assembly, I think more and more, I think is starting to become quite a bit vocal. So, I mean, it's not a secret, quite a lot of really strong resolutions, curiously enough, not curiously, but very nice, supported by Pakistan about Gaza are actually coming from the General Assembly. There's an overwhelming malaise or grievance that there is something that can be done that isn't done. So I think addressing global problems without fixing the fundamentals of powerful and powerless is not going to be possible. We are at that stage particularly. And I fear that moving ahead, any future deliberation on even things as logical or intuitive as addressing climate change or biodiversity or any of that in this climate would not go forward. Paris Agreement, etc., all of that would not necessarily go forward. I think it is interesting that the loss and damage stuff actually went forward. Great initiative in Sharm el-Sheikh. Pakistan heavily supported that. I think it's great. But the reality is far less than the ambition. $900 million without even retroactively supporting countries that have been impacted. So Pakistan is not necessarily in line if there were disbursements from the fund to actually get any of that money is it's tough. This is kind of for the future as well. So what does a country like Pakistan do? And I think this relates partly to question number 3 as well, which is how to expand the pie, not to rely on ever shrinking or dwindling resources that are global or something else. There is a difference between 3 streams of funding for development, finance, and climate finance. There is a difference between funding, financing, and investment. If you look, for example, at the United Nations response to the flood, the first humanitarian appeal, the flood response appeal, was about $800 million, 816, 70% funded. This is actually better than the average funding for any humanitarian appeal globally speaking, which is around 50. So we got about 600 plus. But where does $600 million sit with $15 billion worth of loss and $15 billion worth of damage? Not very far. And that's where the other part of the flood response is actually quite important, the 4RF framework. The flood, what are the 4 R's I keep forgetting? Flood recovery, reconstruction, rehabilitation, and one other R, resilience. The 4RF is a future-looking appeal that basically went to the Geneva Pledging Conference in January 2023, or that was the basis of that had a price tag of $16 billion, $8 billion from international donors, $8 billion from the government of Pakistan. Pledging in Geneva was around $11 billion. Around $6 billion materialized of that. Of that, only 500 million were grants, everything else were loans, repurposed loans, new loans, etc. This is where we come to the second F. So the funding part, 800 million, 500 million, all of the UN system spend in this country in any given year is about $1 billion. So then that's the financing part. There is no uncertainty in the mind of many people in the world that there is a space for loans. How you repay, the quality of that loan, how much does loan repayment take from paying for development like education or health, etc., or social protection, is another challenge. And then I think another idea that is important is the investment part, funding, financing, and investment. There needs to be an expansion of the pie for Pakistan, for people to be actually looking forward to prosperity. And that, I think, is the next challenge. This is where the private sector comes in. This is where a hospitable, bankable environment in Pakistan enables investors, domestic and international. Whether you're talking about corruption, whether you're talking about transparency or reform, or the currency exchange, or the ability to keep dollars or take dollars outside of the country if you're an international company and you want to do well, etc. All of these things come into play. And I feel that with the positive outlook that the IMF is projecting and the World Bank and others, there may be an opportunity for that. But remember that quite a lot of what is being discussed about the next loan program is not necessarily conditioned, but is premised on the fact that there are some reforms that will take place. Many of those are about governance, or about finance, about the relationship between federal and provincial level, about who's responsible for loans. And I think that's important to figure out. So the formula might appear simple enough. Funding you will get, financing and loans, figure out a way to actually continue to get loans in the future, commercial loans, which are hard because of Pakistan's position now in the loan market, which isn't great. And then the investment part. So oil and gas, the same five, the other five is a challenge. It's a big challenge because I think there's this global grievance that for many years, countries that are well off now used oil and gas to become wealthy, and now we're closing the door against others. Now everybody else has to be clean energy, everybody else has to be green. And I think there are opportunities to actually do well, provided that these same countries in the north, in the west, who are wealthy, the ones that we covered very quickly in human development, are actually able to provide support to countries, open their markets, etc., all of that. I think I've answered almost all three questions in a circular way. Not directly, but happy to go back to them again, and I'm sure we'll have some more.
Any further questions, Irta?
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Irta. I did my MPhil in Peace and Conflict Studies from NDU. My thesis was on United Nations Security Council 1325. So my question is that why United Nations Council Resolution 1325 has failed in the context of Pakistan to cope up with gender inequality? What are those challenges which are main hardcore challenges faced by UNDP to make it successful in Pakistan, to make women as a peace agent, you know, why we see the failure from UNDP? Your comment on it. Thank you.
Sana?
Hi, sir. My name is Sana Zulfikar, and I'm a student of Government and Public Policy. So basically, my question was that what UNDP is doing regarding the provision of education in emergencies in Pakistan, and is it possible to integrate or create coordinated response among the South Asian countries for the continuity of education? But after your initial reply, I have modified it like I should decline my hopes regarding this, as it is the most polarized region with a lot of conflicts. So should we still keep our hopes up? I want a reality-based views. Does that mean we shouldn't be very ambitious about it? And does these things like activism for climate, education, gender actually has some value in the incumbent militarization and polarization trends? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm Kola Junaid from a National Defense University. So my question is that environmental impacts, negative environmental impacts, the climate change have a adverse effect on the human development. So how the environmental impacts by the CPAC have halted the human development in Pakistan? Thank you so much.
Yeah, CPAC. To take more or should one more?
Hello, my name is Yusra Mahmood. I'm a recent graduate of Peace and Conflict Studies, currently interning here. So firstly, thank you for such a thought-provoking Q&A session. The thing which has been intriguing me is that although human insecurity brings instability, but on the same hand, we can see that it generates profits for the global elites and war economy. So in such situations, how can we ensure human security for vulnerable countries like Pakistan, which is highly dependent on external aid and influence?
Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much. I'm a big fan of peace and conflict studies, I gotta say. Having done it myself, and maybe in my next life, I'll go back to teaching. It'll be peace and conflict studies. So maybe a couple of things. Difficult questions. I think the ambassador will have to take some of these as well. But I'll say a couple of things. On the women, peace, and security agenda, I think the fundamental premise, partly that came out in what I mentioned as well, is equality and inclusion. There should be no expectations that we talk about women as peace agents or agents of change, and youth for that matter, without first considering how a society actually involves them into a more equal state. Whether we're talking about economics, whether we're talking about society, or go up one or two levels as well, whether we're talking about women candidates in elections, women parliamentarians, leaders of this country, etc. So it is interesting that, you know, in this particular part of Asia, South Asia, almost all of these countries, perhaps minus Iran, I guess, have had women senior leaders at the most senior level as well. And I think in many sectoral areas, you will also see that, whether it's prime ministers or ministers, etc. But beyond that, the numbers begin to slip very rapidly. Beyond the superstars, beyond the leaders, beyond a leader with a vision, and after the leader moves on, then I think you look at the economic numbers, equality numbers, the gender index numbers are actually very, very low. For a country that has 48% of its population, women, you start to look at some of either the quotas or representation in parliament, and once you dip down provincially and district level and all of these levels, I think it becomes a little bit more unequal. So I would say for the Women Peace Agenda to actually support women as agents of change or agents of peace. And we're talking about, you know, small p, not necessarily big P in this case, those that promote social cohesion, inclusion, etc., especially in many cases in countries that have been impacted by a flood or a war or an insurgency or something or other. You have a lot of female-headed households where women are actually leading their family. They're responsible for the income, the education, they're responsible for the future. There has to be a way where the baseline actually is much better than that. It is income, it is health, it is services, and it definitely is quality of life. I think there's a global recognition that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is critical and important. And I think we do have a long way to go. Let me start with the UN system. There was an aspiration, I think, after the last Secretary General, that the first woman Secretary General would actually be the current one. Didn't end up being the case. Antonio Gutierrez, Secretary General, now is here. He's in his second term. I think everyone at this point really hopes that if the world is serious about gender, about women's leadership, political and economic, about inclusion, etc., that at the very least, the head of the UN will actually be a woman secretary general. I think everyone is generally looking at that. UNDP has actually done relatively well in that respect. Currently, we have Akim Steiner, who is the administrator. Before that, we had Helen Clark, who was the previous Prime Minister of New Zealand. She was a great leader, and we've had a number of those as well. So I'm a big supporter of that, but I wouldn't necessarily only consider the Women, Peace and Security agenda as purely political, but also community level, and I think that's definitely possible with a lot of insiders and mediators at the community level. The education question, I think, is really quite important, becomes a bit more complicated when you talk about collaboration in South Asia or in the region. UNDP collaborates with other parts of the UN system that also do education. In fact, in many cases, it's their mandate, whether it's UNICEF, for example, or whether it's UNESCO, or whether it's other entities. A lot of the work that we did on education, especially, for example, in relation to the flood, has been the physical rehabilitation of schools and the softer components, whether it's the curriculum development, capacity of teachers has been done by UNICEF and others. So we always find a place within the UN system to actually collaborate with others whose mandate and abilities to do that more, and they generate more money and they can do it. Women, Peace and Security agenda, we've been doing with UN Women for quite a long time as well. On CPEC and climate change, a very interesting, very complicated question. So I think over the last 30 years of human development, you know, the big rise in South Asia, generally Southeast Asia, of people out of poverty actually has come in China and in many cases also India. So there are lots of positive lessons. In fact, we have a current partnership with China in UNDP in Pakistan that works on sustainable development goals, on flood recovery, on capacity of the civil service. And what we want to do is to do this South-South cooperation work, where more and more in Pakistan actually learn how to rapidly get out of poverty using the China model. And the China model is not the only model. There are other models as well. But given this relationship between Pakistan and China, I think it is an important partnership and relationship as well. So I visited China for the first time in March, partly because of the partnership, only to Beijing, only for 4 days. And I was stunned by how quiet Beijing seemed. Quiet in terms of was not very loud to be in the street. They have so many electric cars that compared to some parts of Pakistan, not Islamabad is kind of quiet, I guess. But Lahore, Karachi, a little bit more loud, closer to where I come from in Egypt, Cairo and Alexandria. But I'm stunned by how some of these Chinese cities are actually super quiet because of electric cars and not as polluted. And I feel that China's trajectory towards clean energy is a model to learn from. Almost everything that we do on flood response, for example, or any normal development work, has a green component. I want to see us do more for green energy beyond just saying, well, we put some solar panels on top of houses. We do that, we will continue to do that, it is important, but there may be other areas as well to explore. So I do think that the partnership between Pakistan and China is really quite critical. Lots of lessons to learn for sure. Not least of which because the part about getting out of poverty, the part about learning lessons to address pollution, etc. We're not talking about 70 or 80 years here. We're talking about a much shorter time in China. Maybe this is a model that actually works here as well. Human security in Pakistan, you know, one of the things that I think all Pakistanis should really be proud of, and I know there are caveats to everything, there are conditions, there are exceptions, but at the very least, over the last couple of years, Pakistan's support to either Security Council reform or supporting the GA, or the group of 70 nations plus China, or the flood response, or Gaza, this promotion and constant recalling of international justice, international humanitarian and human rights law is really quite important. And this is something that I know is not easy to do, but I think has been a critical voice for Pakistan globally. Now, if I had one thing that I've seen over the last year is, I think in Pakistan, my experience, including from talking to a lot of politicians, analysts, and others, is this discrepancy between reality and ambition. I honestly think Pakistan definitely should be doing better in the region, globally. And that's why this opportunity for the flood actually came with a number of things that put Pakistan on the global map in that instant. So it is interesting that shortly after the flood happened in August, the Secretary General actually came. Right? And then the Secretary General, with UNDP's support and others, actually went to the Geneva Pledging Conference. September 2022, 1 month after the flood, a General Assembly resolution on solidarity with Pakistan after the flood actually came out, requiring the Secretary General to actually write a report to the General Assembly every year. So we did one for September 2023, and then the final report was May 2024. I honestly don't know any other country that has been impacted by such a climatic shock that has had this kind of attention through a General Assembly resolution and a pledging conference and follow-up mechanisms like the International Partner Support Group. And I think it is critical for the government and civil society and others to figure out how to keep it going, because global attention is diverted to many other things since then, not least of which Gaza, but other things too. So it is important to figure out how to keep Pakistan on this global agenda. To, I think, take a rightful position as one of the big, most strategic countries globally and in the region, not just because of the 250 million population, not just for geostrategic and political reasons or military reasons, but because of the potential for human development that this country definitely has.
Any further questions? If not, then I have a set of my own questions as well, and I'll go ahead and ask those. My first 3 questions are about the 3 areas that you identified for investment. Human capital. In Pakistan, I think the investment in human capital was affected by the war in Afghanistan and its repercussions for Pakistan over the past more than around 45 years now. And since you also have a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution, I would like to know how you see conflict affecting investment in human capital, because it leads to other priorities for the government and not prioritizing investment in human capital. The second area that you identified for investment, economic stability and predictability, and every time we go to IMF for a bailout package, there is a new set of wants from the people, and it affects predictability. Like right now, we are talking about taxing the retail sector, and it has affected the business so bad. So we want to have investment in economic stability and predictability, but what we end up doing is affecting it negatively. Then the third area that you identified for investment is trust, both horizontal and vertical. And I think in that you identified rule of law and governance support to the government of Pakistan. But the delivery on ground doesn't seem to be improving that much. The corruption perception index remains high. the ease of business remains low. So how do you see, these factors affecting investment in these three key areas that you identified? And lastly, like you mentioned, China and their transition to EVs and how it has made Beijing so quiet. But when we look at the flip side of it, when the Chinese were exporting these EVs to the West, and a lot of the Western countries imposed tariffs on these cars and they didn't want them. So is it the same zero-sum game that you just talked about that is at play here? Wouldn't the world have been a better place if they hadn't applied those tariffs? Thank you.
No, thanks very much. So decades of war definitely impact investment. If you're not spending on education and health and basic services, and you're spending on a military operation, there's no doubt that there's an impact of that. And I think we're talking more than just actual death, for example, where young people, men, and in some cases women, are just not available. The future is actually tainted by that. So some of the recent numbers, I think, where we see, and I think this partly relates to question number 2 as well. And I think these numbers have all been coming out when we're talking about now the 24th IMF program. So the SDG funding gap, globally speaking, is $5 to $7 trillion, and Pakistan needs to spend about $57 billion in order to get the Sustainable Development Goals that Pakistan has already identified for the next 6 years. Pakistan's Sustainable Development targets now are only on track to meet 35 out of 169 goals. So really, really far. The money that needs to be invested is this amount of money, basically about 14% of GDP, 16 per annum. Now you've got a country that I think is projected to pay 40% of its GDP to service the debt. So where does the rest of the money go? So I think there is a structural challenge as well. I mean, like I said, there is a place for loans, but I think there has been a global discussion about the debt problem versus development financing. And I'm not saying this for Pakistan only. The 5 heavily indebted countries to IMF, I think, or the World Bank include Egypt and Pakistan and Ukraine and Argentina and Ecuador, I think. So a lot of heavy debt. So I think there will always be a problem, whether it's attrition because of the war itself, people are actually dying or moving, etc. Or because in some cases of migration, brain drain, or in many other cases because there's no ability to actually spend the money as well, which I think relates to part number 2. And that's where I think the sense of investment always has to be foreign investment is not always the case. There's always an opportunity for domestic investment, but domestic investors in many cases also have similar challenges of rules and regulations that are unpredictable, of corruption, etc. And then I think that's where the point comes to the relationship between 1, 2, and 3 questions that you mentioned. There has to be this enlightened way to figure out how economic reforms, taxation, the NFC award, all of these things actually find a way to benefit everyone rather than appear as a zero-sum. Taxing agriculture, all of this stuff, I mean, late last year, early this year, we put together an agenda that we called Prosperity for Pakistan. The World Bank did something very similar, new messages for the new government, etc. I did the same thing. I didn't see if IRS did something, but I'm sure you did a lot of activity related to messages for the new government. They all pretty much say the same thing. And when we talk to economists, whether they are originally, they are Pakistani like Hafiz Pasha, who we invite regularly to be part of these discussions, and Aisha Pasha as well, who have been saying this for decades. They basically say, well, we have the same kind of formula. We've been talking about it for a long time. Why isn't it happening? And everyone comes back to this idea of political will or inertia. It's just easier to keep things going, or business as usual, or tinkering around the edges rather than fundamental reform. That, I think, is a challenge that will continue. And this is all, I think, likely to be in the hands of Pakistanis, whether they are politicians or the private sector. And this kind of relates maybe to one of the things that I mentioned about the nature of the social contract, which relates to how people see the state, resources of the state. My obligation is vis-a-vis the state. I pay tax, I get a service. I don't pay tax, no problem. And what the state expects back from me. And that, I think, is part of the discussion around, therefore, what does the future actually looks like? Most of the discussions that we hear or have been in touch with the IMF or the World Bank, etc., all appear to be very, very similar. They avoid conditionality, even if some things look like conditions, but we know that there are some impacts. When we talk to the IMF and the World Bank and others that are offering loans, we always talk to them about the relationship between the impact of loans and the impact on the most vulnerable or poor, which will be significant. If Pakistan looks like Egypt for the next IMF program, inflation will shoot up, the exchange rate will go down significantly, and that will impact the poor. But Egypt and Pakistan, for instance, are in difficult places as well. Also, the neighborhood issue for Egypt actually plays a big geostrategic factor. So that's where I think opening up the future of investment is really quite critical, and domestic investment is important. And that's why I think the statistic that I mentioned about this significant discrepancy between the super wealthy and the very poor is probably one space where you see that with a bit more of an enlightened perspective, domestic investment may actually go well.
So I thank you for answering all the questions. Now I would request President IRS, Ambassador Jawhar Salim, to give his concluding remarks and a vote of thanks.
Thank you. There are any other questions? Great. I think we have almost 90 minutes of non-stop speech. We have really taxed the ambassador today. But like such an eloquent, such an elaborate, and a very insightful expose, which I'm sure would be very beneficial for all our researchers here. This is an area where we are really emphasizing, as I mentioned in our discussion before the session. We are very keen on working in this area. You see how much emphasis the UN is placing on that. I think during your remarks and during the Q&A session, you brought out very eloquently. You've articulated it really well. Some of the key points. For instance, gender inclusion. Gender inclusion in our part of the world, we saw how in Bangladesh, just one man, Muhammad Yunus, when he instituted the Grameen Bank, this microfinance, which focused primarily on women inclusion in the economy, with providing them microfinance, of course. And that has created some sort of a revolution in that country. Bangladesh, which was far below Pakistan in terms of GDP per capita, GDP total, in terms of foreign trade, in terms of its exports, almost every measure of economy and human development index now leads Pakistan and many other countries in this region. And one of the major factors is that the gender inclusion there is much higher in many other countries. I think another thing which perhaps, I think you hinted at that, and is very important for Pakistan, is still a rapidly growing country in terms of population. In fact, if anything, our rate of growth of population has gone up in the last few years again. Now, we all know it's pitfall, but in terms of, the dividend, which is that we have a much younger population than most other countries in the world, at least of the major countries in the world. This compares, like Pakistan's median age is just 22 or 21, compared to 45 to 48 in many European countries and mid-30s in the US. So that could be a huge boon, with such a young population, it's a workforce and an English-speaking workforce. We are one of the largest in the world in that regard, after the Indians and the US. We are perhaps the largest English-speaking sort of population, at least. English is second language for every educated person in Pakistan, almost every literate person in Pakistan. But again, we have to see how that adds to our human security rather than adding to our human insecurity. And it could very well do either, because if we use this dividend, skillfully, and we are able to impart the necessary skills to our youth and create the jobs, then it could be a huge boon. It could be a huge asset for Pakistan. But if we fail to do that, then it becomes a huge problem. Unemployment would not only create poverty, would not only create social frustration, but also it fuels extremism. And in some cases, the studies, it suggests that it could help the extremist and terrorist organizations even, like parts of the world where terrorism is very rampant. Well, one of the reasons for that has been unemployment and poverty. So I think Pakistan is at a crossroad. Go either way. The choice is with us, of course. There are friends like Risk and friends in terms of countries who want to work with Pakistan and who want to assist Pakistan as well in ensuring that we not only take the right path, but we move forward in the right direction. And I think it will be very important in the next few years, particularly with this climate change challenge becoming acuter. Pakistan is one of those countries in the world which are water short, and we are set to become a water scarce country if like this continues. And then in terms of the vagaries of climate change, more and more, the type of rains we are seeing now, the type of floods that we saw witnessed in 2022, they clearly indicate that the challenges that we are beset with. But I think in view of all that, there is a much greater need for emphasizing upon what we have what is clubbed together as human security. Because Pakistan is all about humans. It's 245 million people, the fifth largest population in the world. And in the coming decades, it's set to become the third largest country in the world. So, Ambassador, your sharing of ideas and thoughts today with us, they would go a long way. They would contribute significantly to enhancing the understanding of this subject amongst our researchers, amongst a lot of young people. And we have made it a point now in IRS to engage more and more with the younger generation. Because I think this is the generation which in the coming years would be at the helm of affairs, and they'll be the one suffering the consequences of climate change, suffering the consequences of whatever good or bad we do in this area, in the area of economy, in the area of human development. So I wouldn't really go on any further, but I'm very appreciative, very thankful you and your team, who are amongst us today. And I'm very looking forward to future collaborations as well. I think there's much that we can do together in terms of like research, or in terms of like coming up with platforms for discussion together. And I'm keenly looking forward to that. A big hand of applause for Ambassador Samuel West.
Sir, I now request the President of Institute of Regional Studies, Ambassador Johar Salim, to kindly present our guest, Dr. Risk, with a memento. Thank you, everyone. I give a heartfelt thanks to our speaker, Dr. Risk, and all our guests who joined us today in spite of the terrible weather. I wish you guys a great rest of the day. Goodbye.